Okay, so good afternoon. Let's resume our working afternoon. And we have today, it's a pleasure to have with us as an invited speaker for this conference, Vítor Gaspar. Thank you very much, Professor Vítor Gaspar, who is Director of Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. And to present Vítor Gaspar, it is my pleasure to invite Maria Luísa Albuquerque, who unfortunately was unable to be with us in Lisbon today, but who is, I hope, listening to yes, she's already online, on video. Thank you very much, Maria Luísa Albuquerque, for accepting to present Vítor Gaspar in this occasion, and I'll give you not the floor, but the word for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start to apologize. I have a very bad cold, so my voice may not be at its best, but I hope you can hear me well. And that being said, actually, I am not in Lisbon. The picture you see behind me is actually from where I am, Terceira, in the Azores, which is a great place, and I'm very happy to be able to join, even if in this virtual format. So I'd like to start by thanking Jorge Braga de Macedo for inviting me to introduce Vítor Gaspar at this conference. As was said, he is currently the Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. Before that, he was Minister of State and Finance of Portugal from 2011 to 2013. And before that, he had held several positions in the European and Portuguese institutions, including being the head of BEPA, the Bureau of Economic Policy Advisors of the European Commission, Director General of Research at the European Central Bank, Director of Economic Studies and Statistics at the Central Bank of Portugal, and Director of Economic Studies at the Portuguese Ministry of Finance. This is the description of Vítor's career highlights that you can find at the IMF website. So I'm sure this doesn't add anything new. This is something all of you could know. So what I would like to do is sort of going back to the period when we worked together and what that allowed me to learn about Vítor. When Vítor Gaspar took office as Portuguese Minister of Finance in June 2011, he was not really known by the Portuguese public. He had spent a significant part of his career abroad. So he was well known and respected by his peers in the academia and international spheres, but not internally, not in Portugal. Also, he had no political background, so his appointment came as a big surprise to most people, if not to everyone. But at the very start of this period of the government, regaining credibility with peers and in markets was one critical and the most important goal, I would say. We had accumulated imbalances of the Portuguese economy for several years, and those imbalances led to an imminent bankruptcy that made the rescue by the European institutions and the IMF inevitable. We had a massive list of tasks, of measures to implement, metrics to comply, very difficult negotiations to be had with many different stakeholders with conflicting perspectives. But if we had not been able to convince the Troika institutions, our peers, and the markets that we would be able to deliver, then all the work that we had done would then be in vain. And that's where the fact that Vítor was the finance minister was really essential. And I think he was never really given enough credit for that. When our government showed up in Brussels for the very first meetings, I could witness that everyone's reaction was that if Vítor had accepted this role as Minister of Finance, then this government was to be taken seriously and that we would deliver on what was expected. And I cannot overstate how important that was for Portugal and ultimately for the successful completion of our program, this credibility boost that the presence of Vitor gave us with our peers in Europe and the IMF. Those couple of years of his term in office, as I'm sure you can imagine, or then again, maybe not, they were incredibly difficult. They felt like 20 years in many ways. If one considers how much we have worked, how many hurdles we had to overcome, admittedly, some better than others, but still, we made it. And personally, that was an invaluable learning experience for me. And when thinking of how to introduce Vitor, I thought I might share with you a little anecdote of how different it was and the impact that he had in Portugal. And an example is, I remember very vividly, the first press conference he held at the Finance Ministry. So the press conference was scheduled for 6 p.m. And at 6 p.m. sharp, Vitor and his deputies, so the whole team, walked into the room. We sat down and Vitor started to speak. And if you looked around, you would see every single journalist just running around, panicking, because no one was expecting this conference to start on time. It was not a tradition. As far as I know, this tradition that we started to set was not resumed after 2015. But indeed, they were rushing around, trying to get their papers, finding their places, setting the cameras, starting to broadcast live. And we were already starting the press conference. So from that first one, in every single following conference, we arrived on time, but everyone was already there, sitting down and prepared to listen. This may look not that important, but it did set a tone of how Vitor would be rigorous in everything he did and how he would deliver on every commitment. So this is something that I found always very interesting to think about and to remember. As a boss, and I did work with Vitor for a couple of years, I was his deputy for all external matters, so we had a very close relationship. And I can tell you that as a boss, Vitor is tough, he is demanding, but he works at least as hard as the most hardworking member of his team, probably more. So he sets a fantastic example to everyone. He's really, really smart, and he has a great sense of humor. And trust me, again, those days under that immense pressure, sense of humor was probably part of the survival kit that we needed at the time. And those were very, very intense days. When Vitor left the government and I became Minister of Finance, he had indeed done most of the heavy lifting. The most difficult part of the program was already behind us. So I think that he did pay a higher price for the severity of the adjustment. But I think it's only fair to remind people that his contribution to our recovery deserves not only our recognition, but also the gratitude of the Portuguese people. And I'm sure we are all looking forward to hear what Vitor has to tell us about the impact of geopolitics on fiscal policy. This is clearly something very, very important these days with everything that is happening. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Vitor Gaspar. It's a pleasure to be able to join, even if remotely. So Vitor, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Luís. And I want to correct the anecdote that you told. What I'm most proud in that first press conference that started on time is that it finished on time. So, and I intend to use not more than the 20 minutes that I'm assigned so that you can check that commitment for yourselves. Today, I'm not going to speak about Portugal. I believe I have no reference to Portugal in my presentation. I want to speak about the world. I will be making some comments about Europe, but mostly I want to focus on the impact of geopolitics on fiscal policy. Okay, so at this point in time, polarization in the world, fragmentation in the world is something which does not require comments because it's headline news. We see it literally every day with comments having to do with the impact of geopolitics on trade, and I will have some comments on that, but also broader issues of politics and the impact of politics on economics and finance. If we look at the world trade to GDP ratio, we actually see that taking the long run view, we are still in a period where trade to GDP is increasing over time. In the recent past, say from the global financial crisis, we have a plateau in the trade to GDP ratio. So definitely no sign of deglobalization at an aggregate level. One aspect that I found interesting is to recognize that the expression, the word globalization that you have in blue is a relatively recent word in terms of its use. It basically starts in the early 1980s and it explodes after 1989. And it has reached its peak in the early 2000s, and the use of the word globalization is at this point in time slowly going down. Have other words in the chart. You have integration, you have geopolitics that is definitely on the rise from a low level, and you have fragmentation that actually seems to be fading a little in recent years. Now, if one looks at risk indices as they impact economics and finance, we actually see that the current situation, 2024, is not a particularly high point. There are much more impressive peaks in the past. And on the left-hand side, where you have an historical perspective, you see that there is nothing going on now that is even close to the scale of what has happened in the two world wars at the beginning of the century. Now, if one looks at the geopolitical uncertainty index, one actually sees that it's very flat for the US at the bottom, and that it's actually much more spectacular for China. And the US and China you have on the left-hand side chart. On the right-hand side chart, you have the world and you have Germany, and Germany is also particularly sensitive to the geopolitical uncertainty. What China and Germany have in common is that they're two large exporting economies. If you're dependent on exports to the rest of the world, you're vulnerable to geopolitical uncertainty. This slide is one that I take from work by Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, the chief economist of the IMF. And what he shows is that despite what I told you right at the beginning, that there is no deglobalization when one uses global trade to GDP as your indicator, you have, please focus on the right-hand side, that the geopolitical patterns that we see in the world have affected patterns of trade, with the US trading more with countries like Vietnam and Mexico, and China trading more with countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, Colombia. So clearly, there is an effect of composition of trade, and that has efficiency costs, which are not negligible. More formally, the research that underpins this slide shows that there is a correlation between the intensity of trade relations and patterns of votes in the United Nations. So countries that vote together in the United Nations have tended to intensify their trade relations in recent past, which shows and illustrates the relevance of geopolitical factors for trade. Now, if we look at big trends in the world, we see that the relative share of the European Union is coming down. The share of China is rapidly increasing. Look at how much China increased in weight from the early 1990s to now, when it has passed the European Union. And so I have used in Frankfurt for a slide like this the title that Europe is shrinking in a growing world. And you have that illustrated on the right-hand side of the slide. This slide, I believe, is also quite telling in terms of Europe. I took this from a presentation that Isabel Schnabel from the European Central Bank presented in Florence in February. She shows that the productivity of the four largest economies in the euro area, Germany, Spain, France, and Italy, had converged to the level of the US in 1995, and after 1995, it diverged from the US level by falling behind. Isabel has a very comprehensive presentation where she emphasizes the importance of European integration and the importance of the realization of the single European market, but she also emphasizes the importance of IT-related capital stock, and there you see that Europe is much behind the United States. So there are issues having to do with the structure of the European integration itself that are important for this global trends. You can also see here that from an aggregate viewpoint, there is a very strong divergence between the cyclically adjusted primary deficit in the euro area and the US. By coincidence, they were both at 1.9% of GDP in 2022, but while Europe continued to see its budget deficit falling to 0.9 of GDP, in the US, the deficit was multiplied by almost 3 to reach 5.6%, and is projected to stay at a high level in the medium term. That leads to the pattern of the public debt to GDP ratio that you have on the right-hand side, where you see comparing the US pre-pandemic in a shade purple with the current path, you see that the public debt to GDP ratio is substantially higher and it's growing faster than pre-pandemic. The same comparison for the euro area shows that the debt is also higher, like in the case of the US, and falling slower than pre-pandemic. What are the fiscal policy implications of this geopolitical tensions? Well, we do see that there are a number of implemented measures that affect trade and direct investment. And we see quite a strong revival of industrial policy that's in the middle chart. And there you see that these industrial policies are particularly pronounced in advanced economies. Europe is actually the economic area in the world that has announced most industrial policy measures. And from the viewpoint of this talk, the industrial policy measures do have impacts on the challenges that ministers of finance, George, this is for you. Ministers of finance have to face. At this point in time, what we see, and the fiscal monitor emphasizes that very much, is that politics are dominated by a discourse that favors fiscal expansion, that there are strong calls for fiscal support, there are strong calls for public spending, and some of these calls for public spending are subsidies associated with the industrial policies that we can link to geopolitics. Of course, another element which is important is pressures on defense spending, and the connection of defense spending with geopolitics is even more direct. So we have spending pressures, some linked to geopolitics. At the same time, there are political red lines on taxation. There is a very strong resistance to extra taxation. But if you have high debt, if you have high deficits, if you don't want to have more taxes, and if you cave in to spending pressures, what's going to happen is that the high deficits will perpetuate themselves, debt will continue to rise, and eventually there will be threats to financial stability, threats to debt sustainability. On the right-hand side, you have a scenario that was presented by the IMF with spending pressures for groups of countries. We have 7.2% of GDP potentially for advanced economies, even higher at almost 9% of GDP for emerging markets. The pressures in the EU are of the order of 5.6 of GDP. Now, I have actually went ahead of myself, and I already mentioned to you the rise of expansionary fiscal discourse that you have on the left-hand side, and the pressures on specific areas of spending that you have on the right-hand side of this slide. So in this context, what is our bottom line policy message to policymakers around the world? Policymakers should make sure that their spending is effective and efficient. They should spend better. Second, whatever they are choosing in terms of their spending priorities, they have to make sure that revenues keep up with spending. They should use strong fiscal frameworks that put emphasis on medium and long-term perspective, and insure countries against the vagaries of political short-termism, One point that I cannot resist mentioning is that Portugal in the 1980s was one of the first countries to emphasize the medium-term perspective on for fiscal policy, and Carlos Tavares, who is semi-sleeping on the fourth row, was actually one of the main architects of that strategy. And last but not least, fiscal policy is not only a conjunctural policy, it's also structural policy. Fiscal policy is crucial to guide the allocation of resources in the economy and transform public policies, priorities into action in the actual economy. And it's very important to take that into account when designing, for example, taxation and subsidies, and that is something that we also did in the fiscal monitor this time around, where we look at industrial policies and innovation, and we identify what is it that works and what is it that does not work. And we make a very strong case for international cooperation in the area of innovation, and that applies, I believe, to Europe as an economic space, but also to the world. And you just have to think about the challenge of climate change to get exactly what I'm talking about. And I don't know, but I believe I did quite well in terms of my time control and self-discipline. Thank you.
Not only in terms of time, but also in terms of contents. And so, but I believe there are certainly questions, and you will be willing to respond. Yes, Bernard first.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gaspar. I'm interested by this policy trilemma.
It's not on.
One of the spending pressures that will increase in the coming years is indeed about the ecological transition, resisting the increase in CO2, also protecting biodiversity. The problem, of course, with this type of pressure for spending is that these are, in a way, the protection of public goods or the prevention of public bads. They do not have a genuine positive or sure positive financial rate of return when we invest in those areas. And therefore, according to fiscal theory, my professor Richard Musgrave at Harvard, this should be financed by taxes. But here we are, I mean, as you said, there are red lines. And therefore, the pressure goes to finance those expenditures by borrowing. And we have already almost unsustainable debt. Then will we not be forced to introduce different ways of raising money? Of course, in Europe, for the first time, the European Commission has been borrowed further to the COVID crisis. And we hear also views that perhaps the special drawing rights or some sort of underlying international money creation could, through multiplier effects, be the way to organize the financing of those new expenditures at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. I want to follow Bernard's question. So 2 points I had in mind. One is you, in the conclusion, you present really very sensible recommendation. You keep revenue increasing in pace with spending. But Bernard asked the question, if there's a resistance and reluctance by the citizens against further increase in taxation, how do you square that circle? But my related question is, the last point, fiscal policy is structural policy. The problem with structural policy is that it's all about changes. Changes how you live, changes how you work, changes how business operate, and so on. And that is where, again, resistance to change is very strongly felt in practically every country. So how do you address those two recommendations with realities?
Thank you. I wanted to build on that same sentence at the end. Fiscal policy is a structural policy. As you must remember from the fiscal reform that we went through, and even with some difficulties because we were proposing extremely simple income tax schedule, and it was based on the idea that arbitrage would be much smaller. And this, I mention it here also because it was very sad for the president of the Tax Reform Committee, Paul Piticunha, also a member of our academy, that we did take that position. So I would, thinking also that Nova gave an honorary degree to Charles Buchanan, who introduced the dimension of institutions in a very clear way at the time when it was not so fashionable. And then Jürgen von Hagen has developed a lot of empirical work around these institutional and structural problems. I think to say that fiscal policy is a structural policy begs clarification. And I never thought I would be able to ask Victor to clarify, because he's so obsessed with clarity that if he put it that way, it's because he has some kind of killer answer to this innocent question.
It's about this structural side of the fiscal policy, and especially for, let's take global warming or decarbonization. There is a very powerful instrument, which is a fiscal instrument, but it is not macroeconomic in the sense that let's increase the relative price of fossil energy. This couldn't cost to the budget, even if you redistribute in social allocation for making up for some social category hurt by the increase in the price of energy. And this is a very active structural policy. The other aspect is just cut the more than $1 trillion per year of subsidies that the world is wasting in subsidies to fossil energy. With these two structural measures, we could already make the world better.
Okay. So, Christian, it's useful for me to start with you because that allows me to address the question of Bernard at the beginning, and also George's question. Your example of the energy transition is an excellent example of how fiscal policy can be and has to be structural policy. You refer to the possibility of eliminating the very expensive energy subsidies. The estimates of energy subsidies vary, but they range, I'm talking about direct energy subsidies, so the strict version, they range between 1.2 and 1.3 trillion dollars. So we're talking about serious money. Now, that is something, the elimination of fossil fuel energy subsidies has been a long-standing recommendation of the International Monetary Fund. The politics of this type of reforms are complicated, and I don't think that we, economists as a profession, have totally cracked that nut yet. So this is one of the areas where we have active research going on right now. In about a year time, in the spring of 2025, our analytical chapter in the Fiscal Monitor will be the political economy of reform, and the examples of reform are going to be subsidy reform, meaning energy subsidy reform, so exactly what you mentioned, and pension reform as well. So that's a very good example. The example is good also when you refer to carbon pricing and or carbon taxation, and that is the topic that we covered in the fall of 2023 Fiscal Monitor, which was on climate. Bernard, the trilemma was used initially to explain that. So we were looking at policies around the world right now, which are very heavy on subsidies. And we were asking the question, okay, let's imagine that we scale up these policies to deliver net zero by 2050. And what we showed is that the accumulation of public debt implicit in that would not be sustainable. And we were saying and arguing that viable approaches from a public finance viewpoint should have, as you said, Christian, carbon pricing at its core for incentive reasons, but also for financial stability reasons, for public debt sustainability reasons. The set of fiscal policies, which are structural policies, is very wide, George. The beauty of the budget toolkit is that it's very wide and it can affect the economy in quite profound ways. People like Buchanan or Antonio Pinto Barbosa would argue that precisely because the state can do so much, it should, in a sense, impose quite a lot of self-discipline so that it does not do more harm than good. And that, in some areas, requires strong fiscal institutions to put political biases under control. And in the spring this year Fiscal Monitor, we document that countries that have very transparent budgetary policies that rely on independent fiscal institutions that have well-calibrated fiscal rules are much more insulated against the political business cycle than countries that are not. That was something that we were emphasizing right now because 2024 is the year of elections around the world with many large countries and economic entities holding elections this year. George, on the simple income tax, the case for income tax neutrality that we were arguing for so many years ago is still the benchmark to evaluate fiscal tax reforms around the world, and the principles are completely sound. And it turns out that the way the political system plays when it comes to the progressivity of taxation is something that we have, again, tried to understand at a deeper level. People seem to have notions of progressivity that are not exactly those in the public finance literature, but that is not unique to taxes. People dislike inflation, for example, and they seem to dislike budget deficits much more than the economic profession would recommend. So in a sense, research going forward on political economy is something that I encourage all of us to engage on.
Much, Vitor Gaspar, for your talk, keynote speech, and also for your discussion. And thank you very much also, Maria Luísa Albuquerque, for your introduction to this session. And so let's move to the final roundtable. May I kindly ask the participants in the roundtable to take the floor and begin the roundtable. António Martins da Costa will share, Fábio Mazzini, Jorge Braga de Macedo, Ung Tran, and Marc Uzan. Yes. Okay.
Here again? No. It's a different guy. Okay.
One more missing. Ah. Yeah, I think one more.
Ele fica ali. On met la jeunesse.
So good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be the moderator of this last session. I'm not at all a financial person, so I'm coming from the business side, from the corporate world, but it was with big pleasure that I accepted the invitation from Jorge Braga de Macedo, and of course from the Robert Triffin International, especially Bernard Snoy, that is the chairman of the Robert Triffin Association. We have here an excellent panel, and I would like to start by introducing the gentlemen that are here in the panel. Gentlemen, all of them. Start with Fábio Mazzini, Secretary General of Robert Triffin International. He's a professor of History of Economic Thought at University of Rome. And he teaches theories of history and international political economy and European project management, and holds a Jean Monnet Chair on European Economic Governance. He was visiting scholar at Hitotsubashi University in Tokyo, and the managing editor of the Journal of History of Economy, Thought and Policy. He was also Secretary General and Vice President of the European Movement in Italy. So thank you for being here. Hung Tran is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council Geoeconomics Center and an accomplished economist with broad experience across the private sector, international organizations, and research institutions. From 2007 to 2018, Hung Tran was at the Institute of International Finance, where he served as Executive Managing Director. He played an important role coordinating the negotiations of the Private Creditor Investor Committee for Greece with the European Commission, Eurogroup, DCB, and the IMF. Before that, he served at the IMF as Deputy Director for the Monetary and Capital Markets Department. Hung Tran is a member of the Robert Triffin International. Dr. Ousmane Jacques Mondeng is a visiting fellow at the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's a senior advisor with Accenture's Global Blockchain Technology practice, with a focus on digital currencies, and writes a blog on international monetary affairs. He worked for more than 20 years in financial sector and international institutions, including as managing director with Prudential Financial and UBS. He was a deputy division chief with the IMF, working on IMF financial resources in Latin America. He is also a member of RTI. Mark Uzan is the executive director and founder of the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee, a non-profit organization established in 1994 that focuses on addressing issues related to the international financial architecture. Mark Uzan serves also as a consultant, helping private and public sector clients plan high-level conferences across the globe. He has edited several large volumes on international finance, including Bretton Woods the next 70 years, with contributions by major economic experts. And last but not the least, Jorge Braga de Macedo. He was already introduced, but let me simply remind the audience that he was a student of Robert Triffin in Yale, where he got his PhD in economics. He was head of the OECD Development Center and was a director of the European Commission in charge of analyzing the economies of the EU member states, before being elected to the Portuguese Parliament and becoming Minister of Finance of Portugal in 1991. He signed for Portugal the Treaty of Maastricht, that was already spoken about, and was the architect of the policies that enabled Portugal to join the Eurozone from the very beginning. He has been teaching at the Nova University of Lisbon, as well as for Sciences Po in Paris and at the Católica University of Angola. He's a treasury of the Academy of Science of Lisbon, this beautiful place where we are in, and member of the Belgian Royal Academy. So before handing over to the panelists, I would like just to say a few words and make a few comments. As I mentioned, I came from the corporate world, and giving you the view of who is in the corporate world. The major concerns nowadays are especially geopolitics, what's going around with wars and conflicts, and of course the impact that it has in supply chains, in search for critical materials, and the dependence on some of those critical materials, especially on the energy transition, changing from one type of dependencies to another type of dependencies, let's say oil and gas, to more critical materials that are essential for this energy transition. Of course, the financial aspect is in the essence of the business, and these wars, these conflicts, this turbulence is impacting very much the cost of capital, the risk premiums, the financing structure of it. Was mentioned before, to know and to understand what are the incentives and the penalties for this energy transition, sustainability in global. Finally, about the stability of the international monetary system, having heard the previous panels yesterday and today, unfortunately, I couldn't attend the first panel, but just to give you some facts that I've just received about the transatlantic economy, so the importance of the relationship between United States and European Union. These two blocks represent 1/3 of the global GDP in power purchase parities. They represent half of the total personal consumption in the world. They had figures announced last year of trading between these two blocks of 868 billion in goods between these two blocks, which means that is 40% above the trading of the US with China and 16% of the trading of EU and China. So having said that, these two blocks are something that we have to keep in consideration when we think about other monetary systems rather than the one that we have today, having the US dollar as the reference currency. So it's just food for thought. And I will hand over now to, in the order that I've started my introduction, Fabio Mazzini, please.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody, for inviting us and for organizing this very nice workshop. I hope that it's not only nice, but it will be somehow useful for the future of the international monetary system, or at least for the debate about the international monetary system. Well, Bernard told yesterday about Camdesus that warned us against the worst case scenario, which is inaction. And this requires both some careful analysis of the past and current situation, and also some kind of policy proposals. I will try to give my small contribution to the debate on both, first providing my personal narrative of what is wrong, what has gone wrong in the last 80 years about the international monetary system. I will not be that long, don't worry, and then providing a couple of proposals, very concrete proposals. So let me first recall that I think we are here all in agreement that the major problem is the Triffin dilemma, especially in the version that Christian Guimers recalled us yesterday and also today about the built-in destabilizer, which means that in the end, it's the cause of global imbalances, because we have to accumulate, all countries have to accumulate reserves in US dollars, and this this constitutes a sort of trade-off with respect to domestic investment and creates global imbalances which are quite dangerous. So basically, we need to get rid of the hegemonic model which characterized the world in the last 80 years, not just until 1971 for the reasons that were yesterday underlined also by Renato Flores, and we have to go somewhere else, which means basically towards a more multilateral and multipolar world. This is not just the problem for the world on the whole, for the rest of the world, let's say, but also for the hegemon itself, for the USA also, because there is an interesting paper by Greenwald and Stiglitz in 2006, which underlines how, well, they say actually, it's a sort of provocation, but they say, it's a quotation, the USA is exporting treasury bills partly at the expense of automobiles, which is actually true, especially in those years. There were attempts in the history of the international monetary system at changing this kind of hegemonic situation and establish some more multipolar, multi-layered system. I can recall in 1973-74, the attempt from the then managing director of the IMF, Witteveen, I don't know if anybody remembers about him, he tried to provide a multilateral and IMF-managed solution to the current account surpluses of the oil exporting countries, and it was stopped by the US, Kissinger basically. It was he who designed a different bilateral agreement between the United States and the oil exporting countries. And again, Camdesus, he tried to issue in 1994, during the Mexican crisis, he tried to make a proposal to issue 50 billion SDRs to prevent the deterioration of the situation, and he didn't succeed, thanks to the intervention of the United States, together with, in that case, with Germany and the United Kingdom. Let me recall it, just for historical facts. And then we had also other interesting examples. For example, the Japanese attempt to create an Asian monetary fund, which was humiliated by the United States and the Clinton administration in 1997. And well, of course, we have the 1999, since 1999, the experience of the euro, which brought several and great expectations about the fact that the euro would supplement at least the dollar in reserve and payments. I can remember there was a famous paper by Bob Mandel in 1999 in which he said the euro will completely substitute the dollar in international payments and reserves, which didn't happen. Let me just add a paragraph, let's say a parenthesis on this. The euro failed to become an international currency, not just because it doesn't have a military power, which is back of it, as Renato was underlying yesterday, but also because we don't have the intellectual propensity to play the consumer of last resort, because being the lender of last resort implies also being the consumer of last resort and being ready to buy and to provide liquidity both in monetary and fiscal terms in case of major crisis, which we are not ready to do for different reasons: intellectual reasons, political reasons, decision-making reasons, institutional reasons, and so on and so forth. But I will not talk about the European Union now. And then we had the financial crisis of 2008-09, which triggered a major debate about the changing of the system. We were talking about the Bretton Woods II, the idea of having another major international monetary conference. But again, the change was resisted by the United States, that exploited, in my opinion, I'm a bit drastic, but as an academician, I can afford it. They exploited the collective actions problem at the global level, and also some alleged, let's say, national interest to block any major change of the international monetary system. And then, of course, we had the triple crisis of the recent years, 2020, COVID, and the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, and then the rising of inflation again. And now we are living in the most turbulent times, although Victor Gaspar showed that it's not as much turbulent and in some other decades of our previous century, but I think we are in a quite unstable and risky situation, uncertain situation at least. There are three possible solutions to this framework that I see. The first is inaction, because of the collective action problem, because of inertia, because of several reasons. So the first is inaction, but Camdesus told us that that is the most dangerous outcome. The second is what Renato, he's not here now, I think he left, but that was an interesting suggestion, the weaponization of other currencies, which might be an effective way to tackle the situation, but I'm afraid it will become even riskier in terms of global geopolitical balances. And then we have the possibility to create some kind, to imagine, to design some small scale proposal, very small scale proposals, but that in a way can help tackling, managing the transition towards a different and new international monetary system. And this is the reason why I'm presenting here a couple of these proposals that we elaborated within the Robert Triffin International. Well, there may be many. One of them, for example, is the increasing use of the SDR in private markets. Another one can be linking some sovereign bills to the SDR, which is a multilateral currency. So it gives more or less the idea that we are going towards a multilateral system. There is the possibility to increase the role of multilateral development banks, which can play a crucial role also in this multilateralization, also in the kickoff of a different role for SDRs. But let me focus on these two proposals that I would like to share with you. The first concerns the area of Central and Latin America, which is particularly vulnerable from the financial point of view, historically, I mean, at least some countries. So the idea here is to have a very small proposal that probably Robert Triffin would have liked very much, because it was actually his proposal for the European Union, for the European integration, as it was recalled already this morning, as early as the late 40s, actually, so with the European Payments Union, which is the idea to create a regional safety net, a regional monetary fund, pooling together reserves of the countries involved and acting as a first line of defense in case of major attacks, speculative attacks of financial distress anyway. This is very important because I would like to stress this fact that it's a sort of multi-layer structure, because we might have regional safety nets. For example, this kind of safety net, we already have one in Europe, which is the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism. We already have one in Asia, the Chiang Mai Initiative, which is some kind of financial safety net as a first step in case of major attack. This is this first proposal, which of course has great problems, because there is, at the heart of it, there is a political problem related to the political willingness to proceed along this line. But I think that if you find 6, 7 countries that are ready to go on this way, I'm sure that you might find all the others joining in. And the second one is a very old, well, very old. It's not a very old, but it's an old proposal, which actually I made in 2021, which means even before actually that there was the issue of 650 billion SDR by the IMF. Well, I proposed in that case, and I refined the proposal recently, I proposed in that case that the European Union pool the SDRs allocated to them, which means 150 billions, more or less. I cannot remember exactly the figure, but I think it's 148.9 or something similar. Pull together the SDR distributed to them, which are just parked in the balance sheet of the European central banks, or the system of the European central banks, and use them as a collateral, given them to a multilateral development bank, which might be, for example, the European Investment Bank, and used as a collateral to raise 750 billions, which is exactly the same amount of the Next Generation EU. And this is the reason why I called it Next Generation Africa, because the idea is to pull together this money and design together with the African countries, all of them, the African Development Bank, the African Development Fund, and all the governments, a development plan in 10 years, for example, which might also promote development, endogenous growth, a financial safety net, and all the needs that African country may have. These are, of course, just 2 proposals that happen to come into our minds, but there are, of course, many others, but I stop here for the moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fabio Mazzini. Now we'll pass to Hugues Trang.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you everyone for staying until the very last session. The theme of this particular final session is, what is the future? We spent the past 2 days talking about the past 80 years. And the question for us in this panel is, what is the future? And I can give you a very short answer to that. The future is Asia. So, remark number one, the chairman highlighted the fact that trade between EU and US is very big, more than $800 billion per year, greater than trade between US and China, greater than trade between EU and China. Let me add that trade between China and Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, is already more than $1 trillion per year and is growing much quicker than trade between US and Europe. Asia today already accounts for 54% of global GDP, whereas Europe and US only 33%. And going ahead, besides China, which I think will continue to grow at a slower pace, 4 to 5%, but still more than twice the rate of growth in US and Europe, we have other giant economy emerging. India, past 10 years, growing between 6 to 7%. Next 10 years, we cannot exclude the fact that it can grow even faster, 7 to 8%. Indonesia, another big economy, more than 200 million inhabitants, growing 6-7% a year. Again, in the next 10 years, could be accelerating. And ASEAN economies, 6 to 7%. So basically, growth and trade will be driven more and more by what happens inside Asia. And if you look at finance and monetary arrangement, at the end of the day, they are something that happens to accommodate, to support, and to facilitate real economic activities, growth, and trade. If China and Asia going forward is the center for growth in GDP, for growth in trade, monetary arrangement will be driven by what those countries are likely to do. And I think if you look at the history of economic relationship and cooperation within Asia, you see that they have taken very practical steps forward. They started with easy step, open countries, having free trade agreement, trading with each other, but in an open way, not only with each other, but open to the US and to Europe and so on. And with that, they built the basis that we see today. On the monetary sphere, it is without no reason that Japan's proposal for an Asian monetary fund did not go anywhere, because the demand for such monetary integration or monetary union is quite significant and not to the practical mind for many countries in Asia, the sensible step to go forward. So I think that in the sphere of monetary coordination and cooperation, which is the main theme of our conference today, I think that we really should pay attention to what Asia has been doing and likely to do. And here, what Asia has been doing is very much in line with the spirit of the time. And that is, countries want to cooperate, but they want to retain full sovereignty over their fiscal and monetary policies. And therefore, using local currency to settle cross-border trade and investment transactions, I believe, is something that is in line with what many countries and many people want nowadays. Practical, easy to do, easy to implement, and it has a merit of it doesn't need to have the agreement by anybody except 2 or 3 or 4 countries. If you, country A, wants to settle trade with your neighbor, country B, you just need the 2 of them to agree. And then you can take several practical steps to make that happen. This kind of thing is not something that will replace the dollar or change the nature of the international monetary system, but is something that growing over time, starting at the margin, will change the landscape of global payment and then global financial interaction. So let me summarize by saying that these efforts to use local currency for cross-border transactions and payments have rested on three key pillars, all of which have been growing very quickly, not only in Asia, but globally as well. Number one requirement is that each country should develop modern payment and settlement system domestically, but conforming to global standards, particularly ISO 20022, so that they can be open, linked to each other, and made interoperable. It is no incident that Asia, we have countries like China and India are among the leaders in conforming to ISO 222 in developing their domestic payment and settlement system. In fact, the standard nowadays is real-time gross settlement. And India is the country that in the past few years have done the most, on almost half of the number of real-time payment transactions in the world. And China's number 2. By the way, Brazil is China number 3 and Brazil is number 2. So these are the steps that are practical, useful for the countries, and therefore they are willing to do it with or without further cooperative steps. They have done it. ASEAN countries have also adopted and built up their real-time gross settlement system for themselves, and they try to link those systems together. So that is number one. Number two, central banks in these countries open bilateral currency swap lines so that they themselves, the central bank, can be the unit that provide the foreign currency to the domestic user, exporter, or importers with which to settle the transaction with neighboring countries. China alone, in the past few years, has agreed bilateral swap lines with 44 countries, totally almost $500 billion. Within ASEAN countries, the bilateral swap line is about $400 billion now. So these bilateral swap line means that each other country can use each other currency. There's no need for a vehicle currency or an intermediary currency or like the US dollar to effect cross-border transaction. Very democratizing way to proceed. Number three, technology. If you look at technology in payments solutions, US is about the most backward country in the world because they still use check. You write a check, it takes a week to clear, and nobody else is doing that except the US. Payment solution in Asia has really been very much advanced, particularly in China with the use of mobile online payment with giant platform companies like Alipay or WeChat Pay. Each has about 1 billion users. And they are now extending their services from China to the rest of the world. A Chinese credit card company, UnionPay, is now greater than Visa in terms of issuing debit cards. So in card transaction, debit cards account for 63% of all card transactions. And UnionPay, the Chinese company, is now the leader in providing debit card transaction globally. So I think that these are the kind of practical steps that these countries in Asia have developed. They are getting to the point of reaching a critical mass, and I expect that in the next 5 to 7 years, we will begin to see the real outcome of this effort in terms of daily use by foreigners, by travelers, by visitors, and then by business in importing, exporting, investing, making use of each other local currency. And I think that will set an example for other countries in the world as well. Countries like Russia and China, because they do have an interest of avoiding or round-tripping the US sanction by trading using each other currencies. And indeed, they have largely succeeded in doing that. Last year, bilateral trade between Russia and China was about $220 billion, more than 90% of those was settled using Russian ruble and Chinese renminbi. No need for dollar or euro. So to make the long story short, watch Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for reminding us that the future is Asia. So the center of gravity is moving. My intention was to be provocative. Now let's move to Ousmane Jacques Mondeng. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I think my remarks will be a little bit of a continuation of what Hung has just said. I have taken the title of this session very seriously, looking backwards, 80 years of the Bretton Woods Conference, and maybe reminding ourselves what was the intent at the time and many of the objectives that had not been achieved. And I think this is why we have the problems we are now discussing here, but then also looking forward. And I think the local currency settlement that Hung just mentioned will be key of my sort of remarks as well. So allow me to start. So 80 years ago at Bretton Woods, many of the problems we are discussing here were the problems at the time. And one of the key purposes of the IMF was to establish a multilateral payment system. And the intention was precisely so that every currency can be used in imports and exports with every country. The dilemma is that this was never achieved. In fact, at Bretton Woods, the idea was not to rely on a single currency. In fact, the idea was not even to use the dollar as the main anchor. This happened only at Bretton Woods. And it seems to be almost like an accident why the dollar was actually enshrined into the articles. Anyways, the fact is the fund was very conscious that depending on few currencies was a big problem. And the scarce currency clause, which is Article 7, is still in the articles and is a reflection of that concern very much. I think what the IMF has overestimated is that those countries subscribing to Article 8, so basically removing restrictions for current payments, will actually lead us to the world of a multi-payment system, and that simply never happened. Even today, the IMF only considers 5 currencies as being freely usable, 5 out of 145 currencies. And those currencies must be used in repurchases with the IMF. And I think it's a good proxy to illustrate how very much concentrated and dependent we have remained on a very narrow set of currencies, and the dollar, of course, being the most important one. So therefore, I think just as a brief reminder, Bretton Woods was very much aware of the problems we are still discussing today, and 80 years on, we are still discussing them. So I think it is time that we make serious progress in fact, achieving what is in Article 1, namely to establish a truly multilateral payment system. Now, Triffin, of course, is a great inspiration. He reminded us of the problems, and I think I don't have to say it to this audience, but it is. Quite striking how in the 50s and 60s, he recognized, of course, the problem and also proposed a remedy. And I think the remedy was twofold. One, he was concerned about the level of liquidity to ensure that international payments can operate orderly, but then also about the sources. And as you know, the Triffin plan was very much about converting foreign exchange reserves into deposits at the IMF. But I think the concern was to diversify the sources of liquidity. And I think this goes back then again to the local currency problem you illustrated earlier. Because why are we having this discussion? We have the discussion because only very few currencies lend themselves in international, in current, but also in particular in financial transactions. And so if we had more currencies or had more countries being able to use their currencies in international transactions, we probably wouldn't be talking about the problems we have here. And maybe we wouldn't even need the financial safety nets, etc., that we are discussing here. Anyways. So now looking forward, there are a lot of new initiatives. And I have to say, I'm working for the last 5 years on so-called digital monies, in particular, so-called central bank digital currencies. And I think what is so interesting about it is that those have led to a new debate about how to address many of these long, old-standing problems that we're discussing here. And allow me to say that Europe is very much at the forefront of leading these efforts, and so is Asia, of course. So I'm working on two big problems amongst others. One is the digital euro, which is a digital currency to be made available to citizens in the near future. And another project is called mBridge with the BIS, which is with 4 central banks, China, Hong Kong, the UAE, and Thailand, to use local currencies, but using a completely new architecture on how to settle international payments. And so I'd like to talk briefly about both, just to give you some ideas of how technology, as you said, Hong, how technology could be used to allow us to overcome many of the deficiencies that we have in payments today. So on the digital euro, I think what is interesting, to just give you a little bit of a perspective, but the debate about the dependence on the dollar, etc., was very much, how to say, the European Commission and then also the ECB very much used that dependency to put forward the proposal that a digital euro should be used as a vehicle to make the euro more important as a currency and therefore increase the so-called open strategic autonomy of the European Union. So they saw the idea that if we made the euro more interesting as a currency, it would serve the autonomy of the European Union and make us, the Europeans, less dependent in particular on the dollar. And so a lot of the debate here is actually being fueled by the European Union itself, which may be a little bit of a surprise to some of you, but is very much a fact. So the digital euro is, the idea is basically to provide a new medium to allow citizens to have access to central bank money, which today is only in the form of banknotes, but to be also then in the future in the form of a digital medium. It is to be seen as an extension of existing central bank, or it's a new format of central bank money, if you wish. Not much will change actually, except the format, but then the format itself may lend itself to serve new use cases, and that's why it is interesting to sort of talk about it in the first place. The digital euro, I think, will come. Just yesterday, I was in Basel at the BIS Innovation Summit, and it was quite striking, I thought, that there were at least 4 or 5 governors who were openly talking about the importance of CBDC and how it will be transformative and how it will be used to strengthen payments capabilities in the respective countries. So I think it is to be taken very seriously. The digital euro probably will not come before 29, 30, 31. All this is still pretty much wishy-washy. I think, it takes far too long. But anyways, it is a very important project, and it is something that will come for sure. Now, mBridge. mBridge, the idea is, or maybe taking a step back. So I'm working a lot with Accenture. So we have done a project with the Central Bank of France and Switzerland called Project Jura in 2019-21, and the foundation, the new architecture that is now being used in mBridge was laid in with Project Jura. And the fundamental idea with Project Jura is that in a currency exchange nowadays, central bank money cannot be used in cross-border transactions. You use monies that are denominated in your national currencies, but you cannot use central bank money. So the idea in Jura was that it was between Switzerland and France, that a euro issued by the Banque de France, the Central Bank of France, could be held directly by Swiss banks, and that a Swiss franc CBDC issued by Switzerland could be held directly by French banks. And that allowed an outright exchange in central bank money, and in a way which is called payment versus payment, which basically means that we collapse what today in payments is the difference between executing a payment, clearing a payment, and then eventually settling it into a single transaction where the execution is the settlement. Okay, it's like a cash transaction, right? And that brings enormous benefit because it removes many of the frictions we have. It makes effectively, in particular, a foreign exchange transaction completely riskless. Yeah? And so we demonstrated that with that project. We settled a cross-border foreign exchange, so euro versus Swiss francs, and we also used it to settle a foreign currency that was issued in France and then traded and settled in central bank money in euros in Switzerland, so in an offshore transaction. We are using a new platform to do that. It's based on blockchain, and the advantage of blockchain is you can tokenize assets and money, you put them on the same platform, and then you can take advantage of, the ease with which you can move tokens. Right. So effectively, think about it, it's almost like a cash transaction, but in the digital space. That's what we are trying to do. And so Enbridge is taking the same architecture, but now with 4 central banks. We had 22 commercial banks participating in this project. These are all real actions. Jura was also a real transaction, so we issued a real instrument, real CBDC, and with Enbridge, it's the same. And I think it is to illustrate in the context of Enbridge that the biggest hurdle, I think, is precisely to use local currencies. So while these 4 countries, when they typically trade, they would pay in dollars. Now the idea is we're making it so much easier to access local currency that hopefully they will be using or being encouraged to use local currencies when trading amongst themselves. So that, for example, say a Hong Kong importer would pay a Thai exporter in baht, for example, instead of using dollars, right? And that would reduce many of the dependencies that were described earlier. Yeah. And the idea is that by using new tech, by making it much less risky, by removing a lot of the frictions, by increasing in particular the velocity, because everything is instant, that we will make it much more attractive to use local currencies than the current system based on correspondent banks, which long payment chains and long delays and costs and opaqueness, etc., which are well known. So let me maybe stop here. But just as to illustrate that, I think we are using tech in order to address many of the very long-standing problems that we are discussing here. I think there is a real chance, and I think a new willingness as well, to adopt these new approaches and maybe to indeed alleviate many of the problems that again have been with us for decades and have been the core of Triffin's concern. And if you'd ask me what is it that Triffin would do, I think he would want to work with us on these projects.
Thank you very much, Usman. It was very enlightening. And I will hand over to Mark Uzan now, please.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the Robert Triffin Foundation to give me the opportunity to speak here. We have been working closely with the foundation on different occasions, and I'm very pleased to participate here for this final panel. I've been following the Bretton Woods institution, the dynamics and the reform of the international monetary system almost for the last 3 decades. And I will try here to bring maybe some perspective, not about reform, but maybe at the end, we are taking here for granted that the Bretton Woods institutions will be here to stay. And maybe we have to do maybe first mission and first objective is to make sure that we can preserve the Bretton Woods institution in a world that is becoming more polarized and more fragmented. So in recent years, the global economy has faced a multitude of new challenges and unprecedented crises: the global pandemic, the climate crisis due to the global warming, a cost of living crisis, new geopolitical challenges such as the US-China conflict, the war in Ukraine, and the military escalations of the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas. All these developments have dramatically increased economic and geopolitical risk and global uncertainty. Many of these challenges occur in parallel, are interconnected and mutual reinforcing. A poly-crisis, as Adam Tooze has mentioned, has now emerged. And we are coming off decades of supportive geopolitics, demographics, globalization, and advance in technology that resulted in a period of high growth. But many of these positive trends have reversed of late. The tailwinds of global growth, such as growing market, increasing trade, expanding supply chain, and financial globalization, were disrupted by the pandemic. The war in Ukraine has ruptured the rule that governs international order. International cooperation is at its lowest point since the end of the Cold War. and the peace dividend has evaporated as defense spending has risen across the globe. These developments have increased geopolitical tension, and they have led to a rush for energy and food security, a nearshoring of supply chain, and the adoptions of protectionist policies. So in this new environment, we are now facing a new debate about the Bretton Woods institutions and how their global role in policy coordination can be strengthened. Do they have the right mandate and governance to continue to secure economic prosperity? Because of this development, we have also witnessed a sharp rise in both global and within social inequality, which is spurring populism and, if unmanaged, could lead to a new global economic and social challenge and tension. Are these institutions fit for the fight against climate change? What role can they play in this poly-crisis facing the global economy today? And how can they best adapt their operations to these new areas without undermining their traditional core mandate and avoid undesirable mission creep? In addition, there is a problem of managing the crisis of the global comment and the global climate crisis. No single country is responsible for this crisis, and no single country can redress the institution on its own. Can the Bretton Woods institution play a constructive role in preserving the global comment and spreading climate action? How will this affect their mandate, governance, staffing, and funding? But while we need concerted global actions on multiple fronts more than ever before, unfortunately, even maintaining the current degree of globalization and multilateralism will be more challenging than ever before since post-war history. So strategic competition, geopolitical tension, and the knock effect of armed conflicts are exacerbating the risk of global fragmentation. So in thinking about what we should be doing in terms of initiative or reform, I'm thinking that maybe number one is really preserving, the mission of these two institutions that were created after World War II. So number one is clearly finding way for institutions were built for international cooperation, how they manage in a world where it's all about global fragmentation. That's number one. Number two, there is also underway a couple of initiatives that maybe you are not aware, but I think showcase that there is still a very strong interest within the international financial community to reform or to adapt the Bretton Woods framework. Within the fund and within the World Bank, there is an initiative entitled Bretton Woods for the Future. So there is clearly some work done internally at the IMF and the World Bank, really to try to understand what we need to be done to adapt this global financial architecture for the new challenges that the global economy is facing. At the same time, we live in a world where I believe we have two forms of global governance. We have the Bretton Woods-driven governance that was under the US leadership, and you have also a parallel governance that has been building for the last 2 decades, driven by China. China has created a set of new institutions, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, as Fabio mentioned before, major swap line with almost many central banks around the world. But China has been very quiet at the global level. China has been very, I think, prudent always to showcase the commitment of this country towards the Bretton Woods framework, despite the fact that there is a clear problem of legitimacy and quota representation at the IMF, but China has never decided to leave the IMF or to leave the World Bank. But at one point in time, there will be a conflict. So number one is how can we reconcile the global governance that we have within the Bretton Woods framework and with the China-led new governance, and I forgot to mention also the Belt and Road initiatives. So I'm wondering that here maybe at the end, what can bring these two forms of governance together will be clearly the fight for climate change and the global comment. So that's maybe something that we need to be working on. On our side, just to give a little publicity for what we have been doing. So over the last 6 months, we have been initiating a series of international events, trying to understand two major points. Clearly, the mega trend that I've been mentioning in terms of how the global economy will operate in a world of fragmentation and polarization. So we have been hosting a series of events that started a month ago in Austria. The second one will be happening in 2 weeks in China, in order to try to understand the different perspective from regional continents. So China and US will be separate because as the two superpowers, but we'll be doing one in Latin America, one in Asia, one in the Nordic countries, to try to report maybe with a white paper to try to see if there is first consensus about what kind of reform might be needed. But also we live in a world that is so different from the world we have the last 30 years. So we have to make sure that the fact that we have a region of trust, that we don't have maybe an international community, as it's becoming more and more complicated to issue communique as the G20, as the IMFC. So I think this is something that we need to take into account before we think about a big scheme. My experience in trying to contribute to the debate is, I think it's like when you have the presidency of the G20. A country, when share a G20, they always have under the pressure that they need to come up with deliverable. So every country needs to bring new topics, new picture to make sure that at the end of their presidency, there will be something valuable to showcase that they come up with a strong deliverable for the presidency. I believe maybe in our club here, in our all people who are sitting around this table, we all share the commitment towards the Bretton Woods framework and toward multilateralism, but maybe we need to make maybe more effort to make sure that we can keep multilateralism alive. And number two, I clearly believe that we might be moving toward a world that is becoming more blockanization. You know, Usman mentioned these different cross-border payments, CBDC. We see already the rise of a regional safety net. So maybe we might be moving towards this blocalization of the global economy. And at one point in time, maybe the IMF can play a role in to make sure that this bloc will not undermine the globalization framework. And I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll keep the Q&A for the end, and now, George Braga-Macedo, please.
Thank you. I have a small presentation. The title is somewhat mysterious, Triffin Redux. I will be very curt on the answer to the question of this particular session. If Robert Triffin were alive, what kind of initiative would he promote at the regional and global level? As all questions put forth by Bernard, this is very much in the Greek tradition of the Delphic question. So by answer it with a Latin word, Triffin Redux, I hope that very briefly I will be able to convince you of what I find to be crucial in his inheritance as I see it. And what I see has to do with it has to do with him and his wife. She was very influential in bringing Bob outside of the ivory tower. And I met her as well. And we had, I am mentioning several pieces of work, but one that ended up being crucial was my long-standing relationship with Richard Cooper, who was one of the most strong defenders of Triffin in the way in which he spoke about the international system. But Dick was not as radical as Loris. And where I come in here, and what I think is Triffin Redux, is a Triffin that selects areas where things are readier. And I think that the Atlantic remains relevant. Of course, I am fully aware of the importance of Asia. We have spoken about Macau and about East Timor. Of course, you might say these are microbes, but they are there. And of course, gigantic Brazil. Interestingly, an area where Robert did not interact as much as he did in Spanish-speaking America. So I took a seminar with Richard Cooper and Bruce Russett, both are now dead, which had to do with the politics of international economics. And I wrote a paper at that time about how you could apply this to Portugal. It was published in Portuguese subsequently. So what I'm sort of getting at is the message that Triffin and Loris bring is that you have to work in, you have to start by what's easier. And at the moment, the situation between European Union and African Union, North, South, I am fully aware that there are other continents, including Australia. But I think that in spite of the enormous difficulties on both sides, the fact that two are unions and the fact that there is a process of collaboration makes it the easiest way. And why does that include both America and Asia? Asia, I already referred to two minimal examples, but Brazil. Brazil is, I said it earlier, really a kind of different from the rest of South America because of the language. So I have come to the view that a language is important, even when it is not English, to the extent that it applies to very varied countries around the world. So yeah, you are looking at the place where Barry Eichengreen, your advisor, and I really can't go through this in great detail, but what I do think is the three institutions, Fund, Bank, and WTO, have shown a total incapacity of working together. Do you remember what happened in Mexico? I mean, this is unbelievable. It was a not unique opportunity because, of course, as you know, the WTO came out very late because there was a general agreement on tariffs and trade, which was signed in Havana early on. But so the fact that the one attempt of getting those three institutions together, I mean, this was not followed. And the reason why it's not followed is geopolitics. The question I put to Victor too. It is essential that those geopoliticals are resilient, as it is said now. And I believe that between Europe, European Union, and Africa, African Union, there is an easier path from that regard. And it is in this sense that I say that Triffin Redux would include the thinking of both Richard Cooper and Bruce Russett. Just a detail, Bruce Russett was an MIT PhD in politics, extremely unusual. And he was, of course, a disciple of Karl Deutsch. So again, it's from the Lisbon Academy of Science, from the Abbey that we all love. I think this was clear. I ask for focus on where we can have good results faster. And that is my message. Thank you.
Thank you, Georges Braga-Macet, for reminding us that wives are important to take us out of the ivory tower. Thank you.
I didn't mean your wife or mine or any of the wives that are around, including Madame.
Yeah.
But they are important, yes.
Yeah. Let's open the floor to Q&A, please. No Q&A,
No.
sir?
We call it quits because if we don't let him the floor
Yeah,
all
okay.
himself.
Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is not an easy job for me to draw conclusions from very rich presentations and exchanges that we have had yesterday and today. But of course, my first duty is to say thank you. Thank you, of course, to Banco de Portugal, who received us so magnificently yesterday, but thank you to these splendid Academy of Science. We have been so proud to sit here, to visit this splendid testimony to what Portugal has offered as best, its contribution over centuries to discovery of the world and to science and cooperation. Thank you so much, José Luis Cardoso, for this, what you told us already this morning and showed how much familiar you are with the topics that we have discussed together. Thank you for having shown us the various treasures of this academy. Now, yes, and let me also thank a number of other people, including the people of Robert Triffin International who are here, also Valentina Bassano, who has supported us with a number of important administrative and logistic issues. And of course, a very, very special thank you to Jorge Braga de Macedo. We have been really partners in building days after days, months after months over this last year, because our encounter where the idea of having this conference germinated was in June last year, and we have been working relentlessly to make this a success. Another concern is that a conference should not be just something that was wonderful on the instant, but something that leaves some sort of a legacy. And so thank you very much to all of those who have provided either text or slides. I think there should be two concrete outcomes of this conference. First, together with Jorge and others, I will try to write a summing up, which will be sent to all the participants and on which you can send further comments. But as you know, in the framework of Robert Triffin International, we would like to write a book, a collection of contributions on the occasions of the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods conference. We have to do that, of course, in the memory of Keynes and the memory of Robert Triffin. And I hope that as many as possible of the speakers of today will provide a 5 to 10 page or perhaps even more contribution, and this will be coordinated by Fabio Mazzini, our Secretary General. Thank you also, Fabio, for all your contribution in preparing this conference. Now, I cannot do justice to all of the speakers, but I may try to remember one or two sentences of each of them. And all of us at the splendid dinner last night, we heard Clara Raposo saying very simply, we are all the children of Bretton Woods. And that is true. Bretton Woods has shaped the institutions that have allowed several decennia of prosperity. Of course, Bretton Woods was not without some defaults, defects, and indeed we have seen the collapse of the first version of Bretton Woods and the way in which a dollar system has evolved, and it was Robert Triffin, through his dilemma, who drew attention to the biggest imperfection of the system based on the international use of a national currency. And I hope that the various presentations, in particular by Christian Guimers, have persuaded you, as also Michel Candessus is persuaded that the system is unsustainable and that it is dangerous. Of course, we may have disagreements, and it was good that particularly yesterday we had contradictions and debates about in what way we would replace the current system if we could. Let me look at some words or sentences that we may remember. Of course, you all heard Christian Guimers already telling us yesterday that is the de-dollarization ineluctable? He said yes, but no with the substitution for other national key currencies. That launched an important debate, and this question will remain with us, that we are not sure, we have serious doubts that simply replacing the dollar-based system by a multi-reserve currency system is the solution, as some people seem to believe it is. It was very good, and it was an honor for us to have yesterday Governor Cassie Brew, the only person we had who is actually chairing a multinational central bank. And he was clear that his economic and monetary union of Western Africa serves a useful purpose, but at the same time is under threat, that economic and monetary unions can stay on only if certain conditions remain true. At the same time, he said that economic cooperation is easier in a monetary union than in the absence of monetary union. And Renato Flores tried to ask the most important question: how is it possible that since the collapse of the Bretton Woods original system, the dollar remains the major currency? And it indicated all the frustrations that many of us, in particular in emerging countries, have about the instrumentalization or even the weaponization of the dollar and the way the system is run in favor of the hegemon power. And he showed what are all the efforts already underway to replace the hegemon on selected items, particularly as concerns trade payments. And he quoted also Barry Eichengreen saying that we do not need current account convertibility to be a reserve currency. And so at the margin, there are already many transformations underway. In the second session, which was so well moderated by Antonio Martins da Cruz, who reminded us about the level of geopolitical confrontation taking place already presently in the world, the number of conflicts, and he drew our attention that the sanctions had been indeed affecting a larger proportion of the world population, because you have sanctions against, for instance, Russia, but that's sanctions against those who trade with Russia and those who trade with Russia, and this has a chain effects. Hervé Carré was very eloquent in reminding us of all the steps that Portugal had taken to prepare himself for joining from the very beginning the Eurozone. And this was, of course, as he was advising Jorge Braga de Macedo as Minister of Finance. And again, I mean, since then, we know how much EMU on one side is a success, on the other side remains under threat. And even President Macron a few days ago said that Europe, as it is organized, is not necessarily eternal, and we have to take steps. I'm very grateful of what Anup Singh told us yesterday afternoon, and drawing attention to the downgrading of the US debt, the need for new safe global assets, but at the same time, as you know, he has written with Michel Candessus a sequenced agenda. So it's not just a distant utopia, but we in the Triffin Association, we have a specific view of the way in which step by step we could move to a serious reform of the international monetary system. He indicated what were the article of agreement of the IMF that would need to be revised, how we could better manage liquidity, global liquidity as a global public debt. We had several presentations through videos. I was very impressed by Luis Pereira da Silva, who developed his idea of the new green and fair Bretton Woods, even what he called the green swan. And he was very precise in detailing how through funding on the short term and funding on the long term, this goal could be reached. We had our friend Jose Antonio Ocampo, a prominent member of Robert Triffin, who compared the various regional mechanism of safety nets or monetary cooperation over the world, and what were the conditions under which they would be successful. And then we had a very important contribution of Andrew Schenk, who is, he has such an important role in the regulation of capital markets in Hong Kong. He knows by very close what are the things taking place in China. I remind you of the quotation of the 20th Party Congress report. The Chinese say, "We will promote the internationalization of the renminbi in an orderly way, deeply involve ourselves in the global industrial division of labor and cooperation, and endeavor to preserve the diversity and stability of the international economic landscape and economic and trade relations." So we drew attention to the long-term objectives of China in the very the rather cautious way, but at the same time, we should not underestimate at all the rapidity, in fact, of the changes that are underway. And well, today we had a number of other interesting presentations. I liked very much, I must say, session 1 with those members of the community of Portuguese language countries. And I was impressed even by the testimony of Guinea-Bissau, the testimony of the governor of the central banks of Capo Verde. Each of those testimonies is important to us, and we have learned also from the presentation of Mr. João from Angola, who had taken the pain of studying all the areas of economic integration in Africa. And I remember his sentence that economic integration in Africa is fragmented and reluctant to integrate. And we have to see how we can help our African friends to overcome their lack of trust. And also there was a message, Mr. Gaspar, saying that the Bretton Woods institution should improve their support to the African Union and African integration, and doing perhaps a bit less country by country. I was so interested in the presentation of Maria Eugenia Mata, and what she told us about the star-shaped trade cooperation under the former Escudo monetary zone. We always needed to have the historical perspective, and she is a wonderful historian. We heard this afternoon again my friend Christian Guimers. Again, I mean, I liked your somewhat a little bit provocative but interesting way, because that's the only way. You have to shake things a little bit, huh? Especially in the early afternoon. And your questions was, how could regional monetary unions become a game changer for the international monetary system? And you detailed the main steps of easing regional integration and then easing interregional cooperation. I think we will have to meditate your ideas, and in particular your method, because there you went out of the traditional pure field of economics, and especially mathematical economics, to draw our attention to very simple sociological or psychological mechanism on how to bring people together in the face of a common challenge and get them to agree on a way to advance. It was very interested by what Mr. Rodolfo Lavrador told us about Macau. It's an absolutely unique case, and there we have also to learn. And of course, it's a fantastic place to observe what is happening in China, which is so important. And Mr. Lapau again briefed us on what is this very singular, very original type of cooperation that you have between countries of Portuguese language, and their friends all over the world. And as Georges told us, CPLP matters. We will not forget that very important message. Mr. Gaspar, I like very much, of course, your triangle, the way we can try to respond to this triangle and the interesting debate that we had thereafter. Again, the IMF has a fundamental intellectual leadership role, and you assume it because fiscal policies are under strain all over the world with multiple challenges, including the ecological transition, but also the fiscal impact of armament, which is a difficult subject for the IMF, but this distortion of resources will make it more difficult to attain our common objective, which are the sustainable development goals. Well, we just finished the last session, and I think I shouldn't try to summarize it, but I hope that Fabio Mazzini will spread the excellent paper he has written on regional, on the role of regional integration, with his two main and concrete proposal of a regional safety net for Latin America, and the other project is a EU-African plan for next generation. I think there are copies of that paper at the back of this room. And again, Mr. Gaspar, it would be nice if you can help spread this idea with Mrs. Kristalina Georgieva, the redirection of the SDRs in the hand of the European Union countries towards underpinning a kind of a Marshall Plan for Africa. We have already, as we know, the two trust funds that the IMF has established, and to which member countries, industrial member countries, are invited to put their unused the unused part of the SDRs they received recently. I hope also, my dear Hung Tran, that the excellent paper you wrote on de-dollarization via local currency, cross-border payments, democratization and fragmentation of the global payment system will be circulated, because you are one of the sharpest observers that I know about what is happening in Asia, and that will influence us all so much, not only what is happening in China, but what is happening in the ASEAN, and also the way in which the advances in technology will affect the evolution of the international monetary system. Ousmane Mandag, you are also the greatest specialist that we have in the Robert Triffin Association on the impact of, indeed, those advances in technology, the central bank digital currencies, the blockchain, on all the problems we are trying to deal with. And without you, we would remain, let's say, antiquated in the way we approach our proposals. And I think our proposals for reforming of the monetary system have to take into account those possibilities, and you are very much with us. Marc Usan is another source for me of optimism, because it's more than 20 years, Marc, that you are organizing conferences that stimulate the debate on reinventing Bretton Woods. And again, today, you gave us examples of very concrete ideas, preserving global commons, I mean, that could stimulate us. And last but not least, Georges, at the very end, you gave us your very personal recollection of Robert Triffin, his character, even also some of his best pupils, and Richard Cooper. Yes. And again, you inspired us. And my last, and I think I should end up, of course, going back to the CPLC and to the history of Portugal, because our presence here, holding our conference here, is really a source of inspiration about the very specific contribution of Portugal to the history of Europe and the history of the world, to this very Portuguese moderate approach, as consensual as it can be, heritage of cooperation, a unique way to handle geopolitical tensions and promoting regional and global cooperation. I will end up with the last sentence of Georges: progress where we can have good results. So pragmatism also, no extreme ideas, but always remaining positive and smiling. Thank you very much for your attention.